Okay.
Okay, if there is a third grader in this room, they do not belong in this room. So if there is a third grader in here, okay.
I welcome you all with the Hebrew word of shalom. It is a word that means peace, and indeed it is what I believe each of us who enters the sanctuary today is seeking. Peace in our own hearts, minds, souls, and ultimately peace in our communities and peace in our nation and the world. I am Rabbi Randy Musnitsky, and on behalf of Cantor Anna Berman and our president, Mr. John Wishnia, and all of our leaders and board of trustees, I welcome you to this most solemn and sad ceremony. When we had planned to come together to listen to the extraordinary story of survival shared by Erwin Ganz and mark the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the official beginning of what would eventually become the final solution throughout Germany and Eastern Europe. We did so as we have done year after year, recognizing that we must learn from the past, but safe and secure that we were having a better life here in America. The happenings of yesterday at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, has given us a new reality and has brought home once again that each of us lives in a precarious life. And that is why it is so important to embrace loved ones, friends, family, and to stand up and find our voices when we must speak up and speak out, particularly about hate. Among our congregation today are members of our temple, those of the greater Jewish community, those from nearly every faith community. And we are honored by your presence because your presence gives each of us strength and envelops us in the warmth of support. Seated here also, and most importantly perhaps, are our children, grades 4th through 6th, who are about to inherit a difficult world that we have not done our best to give to them. We, as adults, must recommit ourselves to creating a safer, more gentle and compassionate world for these, our children, to inherit. No parent or grandparent wants to fear for the safety and well-being of their children because of who they are, what they represent, and how they've been raised. And so it is now up to each of us to find the courage and meet the challenge to be a united community and once again try to utter the words, never again. And not only mean it, but work towards it. The meshing of this service of memorial, together with the service of remembrance and the commemoration of Kristallnacht, hearing from the words of Erwin Ganz, I hope will move your spirits and your hearts as we continue to work together as a sacred community, truly as one family. And so we begin with a piercing song, Adonai Ro'i, God is my judge, and God ultimately will bring us peace.
So before I sing Adonai Roi, which is Psalm 23, which many of you know by heart, you've heard it very trying times, I just want to take a moment to address our 4th through 6th graders. So guys, you heard what the rabbi said, and does everybody know what happened yesterday? Okay, what happened yesterday?
There was a shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the synagogue.
In a synagogue, okay. And do we know why there was a shooting, Jared? Because the guy hated Jews. And do you know why we're sitting here celebrating this big word called Kristallnacht? Sari? I'm sorry? Some people lived and they did survive Kristallnacht. Erwin is an example of that. And what is Kristallnacht? When the Germans, we wish that that's what happened in 1938, but unfortunately they didn't. Sweetie, what happened in 1938? The Night of Broken Glass. That's a really long title for what? What does it mean? What's it at the beginning of? The Rude Awakening for who? For Jews, in a lot of ways. What else, guys? It's the beginning, really, of the Holocaust. And what is that period known as the Holocaust? What's the Holocaust? Lily? Yes, they did. Hitler wanted to rid all of Germany and all of Eastern Europe of Jews, for sure. Any other thoughts? Jared?
They wanted to get rid of them because most of the reason why is because they blamed them for the reason they lost World War
That's very good. That's very smart. Any other thoughts? Devin? The Jews, the Jews were trying to take over the world. Yep, very much so. And when else did that happen in our history? Anybody remember? Think way back.
In Egypt.
Exactly. The Pharaoh thought that the Jews were going to become so numerous that they were going to take over everything. So it happened in Egypt, which was really, really long ago. Then it happened 80 years ago. So could it happen today? It could. So why did Rabbi say never again? Jared? Exactly. And could it happen again? It could. And how do we prevent it from happening again? Being proud of your religion. How else? Jeffrey? Security. Okay. What's right here? Your voice. You have to raise your voice, and you have to shout out so that hatred doesn't consume other people around us. Okay? All right. I don't know, really. Adonai roi lo echsar binu deshe yarbitzeni al mi menuchot al mi menuchot Nafshi Yishuviv, Yanchini v'magli tzedek, Yanchini v'magli tzedek, Limon Shimo. Ta'aruch lifanai, shulchan neged zorerai, tishanta v'shemen roshi
The prayer I share with you now was originally written for the Jews of France following the violence in Toulouse in 2012. It has now been rewritten in response to yesterday's attack. Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, author of life, man has once again turned violent, cutting down innocence, crushing lies, upending dreams, attacking hope with hatred. Source and Creator, grant a perfect rest under your tabernacle of peace to the victims of murder in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whose lives were cut off by violence, an act of witless aggression and calculated anti-Semitism. Remember the survivors of this horror and the victims of any violence, suffering, or despair. Grant them shelter and solace, comfort and consolation, blessing and renewal. Grant them endurance to survive, strength to rebuild, faith to mourn, courage to heal, and devotion to one another. Adonai, our heavenly God, hand of love and shelter, put an end, please, to anger and hatred, bigotry and fear, and lead us to a time when no one suffers at the hand of another. For the sake of our people and for the sake of your holy name, grant the Jews of our nation, the United States, and those throughout the world, your protection, your wholeness and healing, and your peace, as we all say, Amen. Today we shall be lighting 2 candles, one for the community of Pittsburgh, the other for those victims, 6 million of our martyrs. Together, the blue and the white are intertwined to remind us that the Jewish people still lives, and with life there is hope. Please join me. May the light
Of this candle remind us of Kristallnacht, 1938, 80 years ago, when the forces of darkness overcame the forces of light, because too many people stood idly by as hatred reigned. Little did these perpetrators and bystanders imagine how far the destruction would spread, how long it would last, and how their loved ones would suffer. May this candle remind us each of us to stand up for all who are threatened by violence and hatred. Each human being is unique. Each person is a miracle of creation, and each deserves respect, care, and compassion. Let us pray for the memory of the righteous will be for a blessing.
As we prepare to sing Ani Ma'amin, a prayer which means I will believe despite the heartache, I will believe despite the pain, I will believe. Those who were practicing their beliefs and lost their lives yesterday are remembered now. Joyce Feinberg, 75 years old. Richard Gottfried, 65 years old. Rosa Mallinger, 97 years old. Jerry Rabinowitz, 66 years old. Cecile Rosenthal, 59 years old. David Rosenthal, 54 years old. Bernice Simon, 84 years old. Sylvan Simon, 86 years old. Daniel Stein, 71 years old. Melvin Wax, 88 years old. And Irving Younger, 69 years old.
Anim amin, anim amin, anim amin. Bimunu shlema, beviat HaMashiach. Viviat HaMashiach ani mamim, B'Avi sheitmameyam, Im kozeh ani mamim.
We are only human. When difficulties arise, we naturally look for ways to avoid them. We seek our distractions. We look for ways to ignore or deny reality. But unfortunately, closing our eyes does not improve our situation, nor does it heal our pain. So when we refuse to confront a problem, it only festers and grows. And such has now been the case here in our nation. One way to break the cycle of avoidance is to now embrace silence. Instead of hiding from our pain, we must be still enough to actually experience it. Only then can we begin the process of repair. In silence, then, we may uncover answers that had been available to us all along. For in silence, perhaps God will speak to us. We pause for a few moments of silent prayer.
Oh, say shalom in Ramah. Huya say shalom aleinu. V'al kol Yisrael. V'imru Hibru Amen. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol
Hate did not culminate yesterday, nor did it begin. Hate has a long history since the beginning of time, when Cain killed his brother Abel. But as a Jewish community, we have always been taught that if you can appreciate the past, you can live in the present and have hope for the future. So therefore, it is much more than coincidental that we have come here today to remember yesterday and our history past, and also to have hope for our future. Those words of hope and caution come from the same historical event, one that, thank God, has never been matched in the annals of history, and that is the Holocaust. It officially began on Kristallnacht. And as we take you through just a few slides, we hope you will take a few moments to read the history, to compare and contrast, and to ask the difficult questions: has very much changed? We're going to pause here and ask our 4th through 6th graders to please rise and read the English together. I am a Jew and will be Jew forever. Even if I should die from hunger, never will I submit. I will always fight for my people on my honor. I will never be ashamed of them. I give my word. I am proud of my people, how dignified they are. Even if I am suppressed, I will always come back to life. I believe in the sun, even when it is not shining. I believe in love, even when feel not. I believe in God, even when God is silent. Thank you.
Guys, look. 4th through 6th graders, do you see the words on the left side of the page? Does that look like Hebrew to you? What do you think it is? It's Yiddish. Well, Yiddish is there's German in there too. Yiddish is like a combination of, it's written with Hebrew characters, but it sounds a little bit like German. So that's Yiddish. Auf dem Pripetschik brennt der Pfeil und in Stuhl bis hieß. Und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlach, dem Alif bis. Und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlach, dem Alif bis. Je Kinderlach, gedenksche Teile, wo sie lehren du. Solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, komm ins Alif. Solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, komm ins Alef. Can I have a sixth grader stand and read that for me? It's all of the sixth grade. Because you guys are about to turn 13. Read the words of Anne Frank. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. I keep my ideals because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I do not think of all the misery, but all the beauty that still remains. Where there is hope, there is life. It fills us with fresh courage and makes us strong again. Thanks, guys.
We would ask everyone to rise, please, for our memorial prayer. And together we read, Creator of all, source of shelter, grant a perfect rest under your shelter of peace to those who perished during Kristallnacht in the Holocaust, our fathers and mothers, our sisters and brothers, our rabbis and teachers, our neighbors and children, the named and the unnamed, whose lives were cut off by violence. May they find peace in the world to come. Remember the survivors who have since passed away and the virtues of our people who've died at the hand of malice in every generation. We remember the works of their hands and the messages of their hearts. Amen. You may be seated. And now to bring reality, meaning, hope, and inspiration, it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome forward Mr. Erwin Ganz. He and his wife, Sandra, have been longtime members of our community. And for more than 10 years, he has been sharing his personal story. We are so fortunate to be able to hear directly from one who endured and who survived. Let us hope that it will give each of us the inspiration we need to help our community remain united and in peace.
Good morning. I want to thank Rabbi Musnitsky and Cantor Berman for inviting me here this morning to tell my story. Before I tell my story, of course, I was shocked yesterday when I heard what happened, because it brought back memories of what happened in Germany when I was there. November 9th and November 10th, this year will be the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. After you hear my story, it will not be only the Night of Broken Glass, but I will add the words day and night of broken glass. November 9th, 1938, is the beginning of where the Nazis started to kill the Jewish people. That's a good-looking picture, isn't it? I don't know how that came about, but anyhow. This is why I have my computer operator in the back. I think I better continue. This is a true story of a young Jewish boy growing up in Nazi Germany under Nazi rule from 1933 to 1939, including Kristallnacht. the night and the day of broken glass. I was that young Jewish boy, and this is my story. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany in August 1929, and I'm going to provide to you some background information as to what was happening in Germany during the late 1920s and early 1930s, so that you will better understand how the Nazis came to power. Adolf Hitler ran for chancellor in the late 1920s and lost the election by a large margin. Shortly after that election, Germany had unbelievable high unemployment, and you can't believe how much inflation they had. My father told me that he had to use a wheelbarrow filled with money to buy a loaf of bread. By the time he got to the bakery, he did not have enough money. These were very difficult times in Germany, according to the stories my parents told me. And as we all know, Hitler finally came to power in February of 1933 as a direct result of massive unemployment and high inflation, and blamed the Jews for most of Germany's problems. As a result, because of the discrimination against the Jews, in 1933, my father lost his job as a bank executive in Frankfurt because he was a Jew. Since my father could not obtain work in Frankfurt anymore, the family was forced to move to a small town called Bernkastel-Kues, located about 150 miles from Frankfurt. Bernkastel-Kues, beautiful, isn't it? Right on the Moselle. I just wish the people would have been as nice as the scenery. Bernkastel-Kues is located on the Moselle River. My grandmother, Emma Lazarus, had a small department store there that sold men's, women's, and children's clothing. There you see it, right on the corner. That was her store. Her store was in Bernkastel. There was a bridge right close by, and we lived in Kues. My father joined the business and moved our family into my grandmother's home. We felt very secure in this small, bucolic little town with beautiful vineyards lining both banks of the river. There was even a fairy tale-like castle. Gorgeous, isn't it? Fairy tale-like castle, high up on the hill, overlooking the Moselle. Most of the residents worked in the vineyards, producing Riesling wines. Both towns on either side of the river had no more than 30 Jewish families, with one synagogue. Now, this is the town of Bernkastel. As you can see, it's spread out along the river, because on top is all vineyards, and you couldn't build there. When I was 5 years old and ready for school, the local public school system refused to enroll me because I was Jewish. Anti-Semitism was becoming rampant all over Germany due to Hitler's weekly radio tirades against the Jews. As a result, our security level was beginning to decline. My parents had no choice but to enroll me in a Jewish school near a synagogue in Wittlich, which was about 35 miles from home. Even though I was only 5 years old, I had to take a train to and from school every day by myself. This was the train station. Now it's a restaurant, but this is where I used to go to take the train. I wore this train pass. Here it is. This is the last train pass my parents purchased for me. It says Bernkastel-Kues to Wittlich. I have it here, and eventually it'll be given to one of the museums. It's the last train pass that they purchased for me. I wore this train pass around my neck so that the conductor knew my destination. It was not easy for me. The brown-shirted Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, they used to wait for the Jewish children at the train station in Wittlich. They harassed us, they called us names, and on occasion, they stole our books. Whenever the police were there, and they were there quite often, they just turned their backs and did absolutely nothing. The school I attended was a one-room schoolhouse and had one teacher. I still remember his name, Professor Hartman. He taught only boys from the age of 5 to 13. Every Friday afternoon, I went to the synagogue for Jewish studies. I was a student in this school until I was 8 years old in 1938. During this period, anti-Semitism was worsening, and Jewish men were taken from their homes and beaten on the streets. Signs were posted in Jewish-owned stores, including my grandmother's, that said, "Kauft nicht bei Juden," which translates, "Do not buy from Jews." Nazis were posted in front of the store and kept a record of the people who entered. And as you can imagine, business declined. This is what they put on the store, Jude. You know what that means? Jew. Every night before I went to sleep, my father came into my room and kissed me goodnight. I remember one night that he spoke to me longer than usual. The next morning, I asked my mother, "Where's Papa?" She said that he left during the middle of the night in order to escape the Nazis who were already looking for him. Luckily, my grandmother, the smartest woman alive, had the foresight to realize that we were all in danger and that we had to leave. The big question was, where could the family relocate to? You have to understand, our family lived in Germany for generations and generations and generations. They escaped the Spanish Inquisition. You can see how long ago that was. So they were Germans. My father fought in the First World War on the German side. He was wounded 4 times, got all kinds of medals. Wouldn't have made any difference. It was extremely difficult to immigrate to the United States. And at that time, every immigrant needed a sponsor in America. The sponsor was required to put money in the bank under the immigrant's name so that the immigrant would not be a burden to the state. My grandmother remembered, can you go back one? Oh, okay, wait a minute. This is my grandmother. Good looking, isn't it? I take after her. Emma Lazarus. Now, Emma Lazarus, you know that name, right? That's on the Statue of Liberty. It says Emma Lazarus, but it's not the same Emma Lazarus. Can you go back once? Can you do that? No. There it is. Okay. This was in the 1938 New York Times. And it says here, what is your attitude toward allowing German, Austrian, and other political refugees to come to the United States? Look at this. 67% of the Americans says keep them out. Only 5% said have them come in. My grandmother remembered that she had a distant second cousin who was living in Missouri. She wrote to him to ask him to sponsor the entire family. He replied that he was in his 90s, in poor health, and was living on a railroad pension and didn't have enough money to sponsor the entire family. She wrote back pleading with him to at least get her son-in-law, my father, out of the country. he was able to do that. While my father was on the ship traveling to the United States, and the ship's name was President Harding. At that time, America still had ships that they produced here. While my father was on that ship, this cousin died. Now, if he would have died 4 or 6 weeks earlier, most likely I would not be standing here this morning. My father's brother, my uncle, could not come to the United States, but immigrated to southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, with his entire family. Other family members went to Shanghai, China, which welcomed Jews at that time. November 9th, 1938. I remember it was a Wednesday. This was 80 years ago. The day started out just like all other days. I went to school, and I still remember the day being overcast and gray. When I came home from school that day, my mother was waiting for me at the train station. This was most unusual because usually I walked the short distance from the train station to our house alone. I clearly remember that she was holding a banana, which at that time was a delicacy in Germany. She told me as we walked home that terrible things had happened at our house while I was in school. She gave me the banana to distract me from the horrendous sight I was about to see. When I got closer to the house, I could not believe what had happened. Windows were broken, shattered glass was on the street and in our front yard. And as I walked inside the house, the Nazi youth, Hitlerjugend, destroyed with a hatchet all of our mirrors, slashed our pictures, slashed our sofas and chairs, and anything else that they found downstairs. As I went upstairs to the bedroom, I saw there were hatchet marks on the door frames. All the bedrooms were heated by coal-burning stoves, and these were ripped from the foundation and thrown onto the beds. I will never forget that sight as long as I live. This destruction was done by the Hitler Youth during the day. Remember what I said, not only at night, but also during the day. Ironically, many of these Hitler Youths involved in this destruction, now these were teenagers, 16, 17, 18 years old. The parents were customers who shopped at my grandmother's store. Now listen to this. The parents were afraid of their own children. If the parents would have helped us, their own children would report them to the Gestapo, and they would be put into jail. Do all of you know who the Gestapo was? You don't? Well, I see some hands up. But let me tell you who the Gestapo was. These were German elite military men reporting directly to Heinrich Himmler, who reported to Adolf Hitler, who coordinated the murder of 6 million Jews. That was their main function, was to kill the Jews. Do you believe that? The parents were afraid of their own children. That very same night, November 9th, 1938, going on to November 10th, 1938, became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. That was the beginning of Hitler's extermination of the Jews. The Gestapo that night burned the only synagogue in town. My brother was the last bar mitzvah in this synagogue. They also destroyed and robbed the Jewish businesses, including my grandmother's. What they did, They stole everything. They burned the Jewish businesses, and they called out the fire department. Now, the fire department came, didn't put out the fire of the Jewish businesses. What they did, they preserved the stores next to the Jewish businesses, which were not Jewish. I still remember seeing flames in the sky that night from my bedroom. I also remember the Gestapo. These were two Gestapo men came into the house to take my father away. Thank God my father was already in America. I also remember that the two Gestapo men came into my bedroom, had a searchlight, flashlight, shone it onto the bed, and turned around and left. At that time, they did not bother children or women. But of course, that changed very shortly thereafter. After that fateful day and night, I was afraid to go outside because the Hitler Jugend, they used to march up and down our street past our house. And of course, I was afraid of them. There was a tavern next. No, go back one time. This was the day. Yeah, this was the day after Kristallnacht. Now, what you see here is men lined up. Now, there's another picture. Isn't there another picture with a school? Yeah, right here. You see in the background, there's school children watching the men being taken away. And you see Nazi officers in front of the children. Terrible. Like I say, there was a tavern. Here's our house, the White House. That was where we lived. There was a tavern next to our house. And every night we could hear the Nazis singing songs about killing the Jews. You can imagine how many nightmares we had and how frightened we were. Since my grandmother's store was not completely destroyed, the Nazis took over the store without any compensation. The school I attended in Whitlish was destroyed. Soon after, there was a directive by the Gestapo that said all Jews had to turn in all of their gold, silver, bank accounts, and all other valuables. If they refused, they were put into jail. I still remember my grandmother and my mother taking whatever they had down to the Gestapo headquarters in town. During this period, our devoted housekeeper, who worked for the family for many, many, many years, a Frau Hillen, who no longer was allowed to work for us, took a huge risk and brought us food during the middle of the night. She is, in the eyes of the Jewish people, a righteous Gentile and is so honored in the state of Israel. Let me go back one time. Based on the 1935 Nuremberg directives, they put these laws in 1935. No Gentile was allowed to associate with any Jew. No Gentile doctor was allowed to take care of a Jewish person, and vice versa. No Jewish doctor was allowed to take care of a Gentile person. Jews were no longer citizens of the state of Germany. And all other provisions of citizenship were taken away. At this time, all mail sent outside of Germany, written by Jews, was censored by the Gestapo. I was told that before my father left for the United States, that he and my mother set up a unique system to thwart the Nazis from knowing about our well-being. My mother would snip a lock of my hair and put it into each envelope to tell my father that things were still okay. Letters that did not have that lock of hair told him that things were getting worse. And as you can see, my mother wrote a lot of letters. Meanwhile, my father was working very hard in order to save enough money to bring the rest of the family to the United States. Okay, now, my mother, brother, and I left Germany in April of 1939 on the ship President Roosevelt. They only allowed us to take out 10 Deutschmark, which at that time is about $4. Now, here what you see, forget about those two people on the left. My mother is sitting there. My brother is on the right, and that cute little boy in the middle, that's me. See him? That's me coming over to America. My grandmother was lucky enough to come out on one of the last boats out of Germany in 1941. Many of our family members were not as lucky, and they were killed in the concentration camps. I had no uncles. I had no cousins. I had no aunts. Everyone was killed in the concentration camps. About 50 years after I left Germany, that's a long time, 50 years, because I was 8 years old or 9 years old when I left Germany. I went back and visited Bernkastel-Kues. I wanted to see what happened to our house, and I also wanted to see what happened to my grandmother's store. I knocked on the door of the house, and an elderly woman and her daughter answered. I introduced myself, and the owner was very surprised to see me after all these years. Later, she told me she was worried that I was coming back to take away her house that the Nazis had taken away from us. As she took me through the house, I was still able to see the hatchet indentations on the door frames. Remember now, this was over 50 years afterwards. Of course, it was covered by many coats of paint. Even though I was anxious to see the house, it brought back bad memories. You see what it is now. Now, this is current. This is the last 12 years. See the house now? It's different color, brown, and there's the tavern right next to it. See, it looks different now. I then went to see what was left of the old synagogue. It was now a machine shop. However, you could still see the Star of David on top of the building. My grandmother's store was now a tavern or a small restaurant. I then drove, there's the synagogue. I then drove the 35 miles back to Whitlish, where I went to school. Like I said before, the school was no longer there. However, I couldn't believe it. The synagogue was still standing, and it had a sign outside. And of course, I was curious to see what that sign says. It said Jewish Museum. Of course, I was curious to go inside. I went inside, and I was greeted by a caretaker. And when I walked inside, in the front steps, there was a large glass display. And this display, now this is the caretaker telling me what's in this glass display. Was a Torah, Kiddush cup, there was a prayer shawl, and a few other Jewish artifacts. Now, some of the students in other schools used to ask me, in fact, most of the students asked me, did you tell this caretaker that you were a student in this synagogue when you were a child? I never told him that. I wanted to hear what he had to say. He said there were no longer any Jewish families living in Whitlish or the surrounding communities. He talked about the history of the Jews as though what happened thousands and thousands of years ago. But we all know this is not ancient history, but current history, and it gave me a very eerie feeling. About 12, I guess it's now 13 years, about 13 years ago, the city of Frankfurt, where I was born, in order to absolve their guilt, invited my wife and I back for 2 weeks at their expense. At first, I was very apprehensive about accepting this invitation and leery about going back to Frankfurt, where over 5,000 Jews were sent to the concentration camp and to death. However, finally, we decided that it would be good to revisit my roots. There were 25 of us in the group as children living in Frankfurt. Many of these children were sent away on kinder transport. Anybody know what that is? Anybody here? You heard about it?
Transport back to concentration camp.
No, not okay. Now, there was a short period of time where Hitler allowed children 12 years and younger to leave the country. Short period of time. The parents took their children to the train station, and most of them went either to England or to Scandinavia. Took them to the train station and told them they were going on a vacation and that they would join them very shortly. But many of those parents never saw their children again. People came from as far away as England, Israel, South Africa, and even Australia to visit, to share of their horrendous experiences. As I got older, my parents told me where we lived in Frankfurt, the synagogue where we worshiped, and the cemetery where my paternal grandparents are buried. I was glad that they did, because that enabled us to revisit my history. Okay, I'll tell you about in a minute what this is. There were many memorable events that took place during the 2-week visit to Frankfurt. However, there were two that stand out the most. One was a visit to the Jewish cemetery where my grandparents are buried. Most of the graves in that cemetery were knocked down. And what the Nazis did, now here's my grandparents, Lena Ganz, Solomon Ganz. This is it. This particular stone was still standing. Now what the Nazis did, they took the metal off. This was all metal in the front. They took that off and they used it for the war efforts. The wall surrounding, here's the wall surrounding the cemetery. The wall surrounding the cemetery had over 5,000 small brass nameplates of Jews who lived in Frankfurt and were murdered by the Nazis. Each nameplate, here's a close-up, each nameplate showed the name, the birth date, the date they were murdered, and the name of the concentration camp where they were killed. The one thing the Germans are known for, and very efficient at, and that is record keeping. The other memorable event was when the host of the group invited people to speak of their experiences. I volunteered to visit a German high school in Frankfurt. It was the last day of school before the summer holiday. And before I spoke to the students, the principal invited me into his office. After pleasantries, he then looked at me and he said, "I must tell you that my father was a Nazi." Now, I don't know what he expected me to say, whether I should have jumped up and killed him or did something. But I told him that I cannot blame the parents, the children and the grandchildren of what the parents did. I then went into the room where there were over 125 senior students. And believe me, the temperature in that room was over 90 degrees. At the end of my discussion, and I spoke to them just like I'm speaking to you, one of the students said to me that she read in the paper that there was anti-Semitism in the United States and wanted my opinion. I said, unfortunately, yes, it does exist. However, the big difference was in Germany, it was condoned and the policy of the German government and resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews. And as we all know, in the United States, religious discrimination is against the law, right? And is punishable. I told the group and stressed that they were the future and they must resist all discrimination, for what I endured should never happen again. This time there was another visit to Bernkastel Coos, this time with my wife, one of our sons, and his son. I especially wanted them to visit Bernkastel to see for themselves where we lived, where I lived, and also to find someone, after all these years, to find someone who might still remember my grandmother, my grandmother's store, or my father. I spent the day going up and down speaking to elderly people. My family laughed at me after all these years. He says, no one's going to remember. I then spoke to an elderly lady, and she says, why don't you go to the local old age home? It was a nursing home, old age home, which I did. Now what you see here, the bottom is a church. I think it was a Lutheran church, the bottom, and the top was the old age home. This was in Bernkastel. In that window over there, a nurse popped her head out. I explained to her in German what I was looking for, and she sent down an elderly gentleman to speak to me. When he came down, it seemed like either he didn't understand or he was hard of hearing. Again, the nurse popped her head out of the second floor window and she said she would bring down his hearing aid. However, that also didn't work. And at that time I said, Danke, auf Wiedersehen, thank you and goodbye. Since we had to leave, I was very disappointed. Just then my wife spotted two elderly ladies. Now here we are, right in the front door. The lady on the left, I'm over there, the lady on the left. They just returned to the nursing home, and she says, why don't you ask them? The lady on the left said when she was a little girl, she remembered that a man used to come by car to her house selling clothing. And she remembered that when she was a little girl, she received a beautiful dress. And before I had a chance to say anything further, she said his name was Herr Ganz, my father. Of course, that made my day. Okay, one more visit. This time our oldest son, he didn't want to be left out. His wife and our grandson and their son went to Bernkastel. He wanted to see where I lived. And while there, we were introduced to the town historian. There you see him on the right. Now, you got to picture this. Of course, Bernkastel and Coos were very small towns, so he knew everybody in town from way, way back. He was also in the Second World War, of course, on the German side. Walking in that house, we couldn't believe what we saw. He had uniforms from World War I, World War II, emblems, hats, and so forth. But anyhow, then he brought out a large black book. And that black book, first of all, he showed me the death certificate of my grandfather who died in 1932. Then he brought out a document of my grandmother's advertising, newspaper advertising, which was over 100 years old. Okay, then he brought out, oh, wait a minute now, let me tell you this. This is my grandfather's stone in Bernkastel, very small. Now, if you look closely next to that, see that green area? Well, there's nobody there because those people, they died in the concentration camp. So there was very few people, because there's only a small amount of Jews in Bernkastel, that portion was all empty, and only this side. But my grandfather's stone is still there. But anyhow, then he brought out this document. This document was prepared by the Gestapo in October 1939. And what this historian told me was that this was a document that showed the names of all the Jews who lived in Bernkastel, Coos, and the surrounding community. And it shows the name, the age, and where the people lived and other things. Now, this document was used by the Gestapo to pick up the Jews and to send them to the concentration camps. Now, you look over here, you see my mother's name, my brother's name, and below that is my name. Thank God we left in April of 1939. This was produced in October 1939. Before I finish, I got one more story to tell you. I forgot to tell you before, but anyhow, when I spoke to the students in Germany, another student said to me, now that you're retired, isn't it time for you to come back to Frankfurt and Germany and live the rest of your life in Germany? I told the student, do you want a short answer or a long answer? Because both answers would be never. My country is America. America saved my life, and I would do anything for this country that they ask of me. And I told them, even with some of the problems that this country has, I told them that it is still the best country in the world. Thank you very much. Questions? Too late. Too late.
Before we dismiss our children and the adults, no, Erwin, please stay here. Yes, yes. We are going to have some quiet time if you would like to ask some questions of Erwin. Our gratitude to him knows no bounds, and his ability to tell his story with such historical accuracy, but more importantly, with the emotion of one who has seen with his eyes and felt with his heart, is something we will never, ever be able to recapture. So, Erwin, we are so grateful. It is so important to remember and to know and to have hope for the future. So Erwin doesn't know this, nor does our congregation, but I want to tell you about a national effort that is taking place in gratitude to all those who keep their stories alive, to plant daffodils in communities, representing, of course, the yellow star that should never again mean death, but should mean light. It is known as the Daffodil Project. And we here at the congregation today will plant our very first 75 bulbs in honor of Erwin.
Oh, thank you very much.
That job will go to our 4th, 5th, and 6th graders because they are the ones who will nurture these plants, and each and every year we will add more. And I just want to read it. Resilient, bright, and filled with hope, these daffodils, which return with a burst of color each spring, are a part of the worldwide living historical Holocaust memorial that inspires us to plant 1.5 million daffodils in memory of the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust, and for the children who suffer in humanitarian crises around the world. Because as Elie Wiesel said, how can a person not be moved by compassion And above all, how can anyone who remembers remain silent? And we are so very grateful that Erwin has never remained silent. Thank you, Erwin. We are going to dismiss our students to their classes, and the adults I would ask to please remain, as we do have a closing prayer and some additional thoughts to share with you as well. If you would like to stay and please meet Erwin and converse with him. I'm sure there are many questions and gratitude as well.
Any questions? Yes.
How did you still have enough money to leave for America, and what was your path? Where was the ship, and how did you get to the ship?
Yeah, I was going to tell you also, there was enough money. So we were supposed to give the Germans all the money, but there was some places, where we had, so there was enough money for that. Also, if you notice in the picture of when we traveled to the United States, we all had beautiful clothes on. Now, that was the last thing my mother did before we left. When she went out, and whatever she had, she'd bring us proper clothes. Anybody else? Yes.
How did you develop where you were at school when you got here?
Well, that's a good question. If you had about 2 hours, I can tell you life in America. Believe me, that's just as interesting as our life in Germany now, but I'll give it to you shortly. When I came to this country, of course, I didn't know any English. There was no, in Germany, it was only German. So they put me back 6 months in school. But one thing in Germany, the studies, I didn't have any problems with the studies here because, I don't know, either they were ahead or what, but I didn't know the language. So 6 months after I went here, I was able to communicate. And, I have to tell you this story. I don't know, you have a little time? I have to tell you this time. In Germany, I didn't play with anybody. No Gentile child would ever play with me. There weren't any Jews. Nobody would get out in the street to play or go to another person's home because they were afraid they were going to get beat up. When I came to this country, I saw boys playing in the street. We lived in Folly Avenue in Newark, off Clinton Avenue. And I saw boys playing in the street, playing stickball. And I never saw a stickball. One day I went downstairs. I still didn't speak English not very well. They didn't know what to do. So what they did, and it was a thoroughfare. So what they did, they put me in the front of the street. Every time a car came, I used to yell out, Achtung. But eventually, I went into it. And of course, when I went to school, my parents didn't have any money. I had to work. I was 9 years old when I came to this country. My brother had to work. My mother had to work. She never worked in her life. I don't say she worked. She was a homemaker. But I had to go to work. So after school, I didn't play soccer. I didn't play baseball. I didn't do this. I went to work. My first job was in a bakery in Newark. What did I do? Well, at that time, people didn't, they stayed in their homes. Some of them were elderly. So I had to go to the people's homes, find out if they needed a bread, 2 donuts, or a cupcake, went back to the bakery, and delivered. I was glad to get any 2 cents tip.
People watching online.
Oh, online. Hello. Let me tell you, before you ask that question, let me tell you one other thing. Some of the students, and this was in Drew University when I spoke there, they asked me, when you went back to Germany so many times, did you find any anti-Semitism in Germany? I had to think about it a moment, and then I said, I'll leave that up to you. Now, let me tell you the story. You saw the cemetery, very small, but I know also there is a gate, and there's a locked gate, so you have to have a key to get into the cemetery.
This was in Berncastle.
Oh, a voice from the back. Yeah, this was, you can come out now.
I like it.
This was in Bernkastel. And they also told me from people who were there before that the key was kept in the Chamber of Commerce. Sandra and I went to the Chamber of Commerce, and there was a middle-aged woman sitting behind the desk, and I said, I introduced myself, who I was. I said, can I please have the key so that we can go into the cemetery? She says she's sorry because this was a weekend. It was a Sunday, actually. She said on weekends, the key is kept at the mayor's office, and she's sorry, but no key. We were disappointed because we had to leave the next day. Just as we walked out, an elderly man came and stopped us and says, can I help you? Again, we said who we were, and he pointed to the woman behind the desk and says, would you please give him the key? So I'll leave it up to you if that was anti-Semitism. Yes, there was a... in Missouri, you're talking about. No, we never went to... This cousin was living in Missouri, but we never went to Missouri. We stayed in Newark. We stayed in the... Yeah, of course, yes. He stayed there too. And I mean, listen, he was a bank executive. When I say bank executive, he had a good job. When he came here, who's going to hire him? He's not going to hire him in a bank. At that time, no Jew was going to be allowed to work in a bank. So what he did, he went to the country, to the farms, and he bought eggs. And he sold those eggs to other Jewish people in Newark. And then he got into the butter, then he got into other products, food products, and by that he opened up a business. Yes, Chris.
What was your path from Germany over to the States? Like, you took a ship?
Well, there was no planes at that time, so I couldn't walk. No, we took a ship. In other words, the ship was President Roosevelt. Let me tell you, it took us 8 or 9 days to come over, and I was sick for 7.5 days because the weather was just so bad. It was just terrible. But anyhow, we arrived. And we didn't have to go through Ellis Island because my father was here. And our first experience in the United States was my father picked us up in his old car, and on the way to Farley Avenue where we lived, he had a flat tire. So our first experience in America was trying to fix a flat tire. Anybody else? Yes?
I have 2 questions. You said your father's brother ended up in Zimbabwe?
My uncle. My uncle.
Did your family ever reconnect with him?
Oh, sure. Let me tell you about Zimbabwe when he went there. He had a wonderful life, his daughter and the children, wonderful life in Zimbabwe. Of course, that changed very, very rapidly. And they couldn't live there anymore. They went to South Africa. Good life there too. Couldn't live there anymore. Because every time he went out from his garage in a car, he was afraid that somebody would do something or steal something. Anyhow, they all moved. My uncle went to Switzerland. His daughter went to England, and their children went to Australia. Now, both my father and my uncle died when they were 97. My uncle still had a girlfriend. He was 92 years old when he had a girlfriend. He used to bring the girlfriend to the United States. We were afraid that she might have children. I got the thing, I think.
Well, Erwin will certainly remain with us immediately following the close of this morning. But once again, Erwin, we were so incredibly fortunate, and the stars sadly aligned for us to find the meaning and the purpose of coming together today and to remembering Kristallnacht, but also, and perhaps most importantly, for the stark reminder that what happened 80 years ago can still happen anywhere, including in our own nation. And therefore, we must continue to be vigilant. First, we must mourn. Then we will remember. but then we must act. And so, in closing of our service, we pray, O God, you have given us a wonderful and horrible world. Why? Why is this world so beautiful and majestic and yet so full of hatred and pain? Why is there abundance and yet there's also dire poverty, kindness, and cruelty? Why do some live in peace while others live in fear? Why did you bless us with one hand, God, and then curse us with the other? Please show yourself, dear God, and help us. Give us the wisdom to eradicate disease, the tools to end hunger, the courage and the compassion to overcome hatred and bloodshed. Turn our complacency into action, soften our hardened hearts, and transform our despair into hope. Grace us with your presence, O God. Teach us how to bless our world with the greatest gift of all, Shalom. Amen. To help us find our stories, I just want to bring forward for one moment a past president of our congregation and a woman who is working on a most important project here in our community, Jessica Wang.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you, Erwin. Erwin said before he started to speak, well, how many times can you see me and hear me speak? And the answer is not enough. The 4th to 6th graders who were here, I'm going to venture to guess this may be the one and only time in their lifetimes that they will see, hear, and feel a Holocaust speaker, one so eloquent as Erwin. And although I know Erwin well and I know he exercises and he keeps in good health, there aren't enough Erwins left here in New Jersey and in the region. And after Erwin spoke to my daughter's 6th grade public school class 3 years ago, she invited him in. He told this same story. I realized that for those children, maybe more than our own who were sitting here this morning, that would be probably the one and only time that they heard a Holocaust speaker speak. Larry Glazer, the New Jersey Holocaust Commission president, told me recently that they're doing a census of New Jersey Holocaust survivors, and he predicts right now that there will be about 500 left. So the question is, what do we do? I'm the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. Any of you also grandchildren of Holocaust survivors? Wonderful, I'm gonna keep you in mind. And I thought, well, who is going to tell these stories in this climate of anti-Semitism when, as we saw yesterday, the dog whistle has been blown? I think of my grandfather's brothers who were killed not by Nazis, but by their neighbors. And who's going to tell that story? Who's going to tell Erwin's story? So recently, Nancy Gurel, who founded the Holocaust Center at the Shimon and Sarah Birnbaum JCC, where if you or relatives of yours are Holocaust survivors, they can be registered. It's digital, very easy to do. Brought me and 2 women I didn't know from the JCC and from the community together, Elise Wolf and Michelle Edgar, to form what is called 3GNJ, the third generation of Holocaust survivors, their grandchildren, who are going to dedicate themselves to educating diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and provide support to those descendants of survivors. The big thing that we'll be doing is being trained by 3G New York, third generation Holocaust group in New York City, founded in 2005, over 2,000 members. And we will be the ones, and I invite you too, if you're a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, to take our family stories, make sure they don't remain at our dinner tables and our seders and so forth, and take these stories out to schools, community groups like this one, and beyond. So if you're so interested or know somebody who may be interested, I have a quick little flyer. Our next meeting is January 9th at the JCC, and there will be a kickoff of the Holocaust Center April 14th at the JCC. And this summer, we'll be doing a 4-evening series of training for people like myself and maybe yourselves who dedicate themselves to telling these stories beyond the time that our friends and survivors can tell them themselves. So if you are a survivor, grandchild of a survivor, please, or no one, please stop and see me. I'll wait at the door. Maybe you could take a flyer. There's a description of the group on the back. I really appreciate a couple of minutes of your time, and certainly thank you again to Erwin.
Yes, Erwin, thank you very much. This is an old song, but it's in Yiddish, and in honor of Erwin, I just definitely want to be able to sing it with you. You'll recognize it as soon as you hear the refrain, so please join me. A special thank you to Nancy for coming out this morning for the music. So please, Nancy. Steht der Buche, steht und tragt a ganze Nacht. Wem ihn zu nehmen und nicht verschämen, wem ihn zu nehmen und nicht verschämen. Tumbala, tumbala, see you recognize it. Laika, tumbala, 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 like. Tumbala, like, spiel balalaika, tumbala, like, freilich soll sein. Mädel, Mädel, ich will bei mir fragen, was kann wachsen und regnen, was kann brennen und nicht aufhören, was kann gehen, weinen und tränen. Tumbala, 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 like, tumbala, 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 like. Tumbalalaika, spielbalalaika, tumbalalaika, freilich soll sein. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope you were as filled emotionally and spiritually and with history as all of us were here as leaders of the congregation.
Just a reminder that this Friday night we will be joining together for the first Shabbat prior to the tragedy in Pittsburgh. And for the first time, we will be reading the names and reciting Kaddish and doing a remembrance as a community. So please feel free to come and join us at 7:30 Friday evening, November 2nd. And to each and every one of you, we say shalom. And please take a moment to meet Erwin and share your thoughts and gratitude with him directly. Many thanks.